Something isn't adding up. Over the past few days, Americans have been told to focus on the growing tensions between the United States and Iran. The headlines are predictable: military threats, strategic responses, diplomatic warnings, the possibility of a wider conflict. But there is something strange about the way this story is unfolding. Because while most people are watching military developments, financial markets appear to be watching something else entirely. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the most important part of this story has almost nothing to do with war? At first glance, that sounds absurd. After all, missiles are being discussed. Military options are being debated. Analysts are talking about regional stability. Yet behind all of those conversations, another concern continues to appear. Oil, not military victories, not political speeches, not even diplomatic negotiations. Oil. Why? Why would investors, corporations, shipping companies, and financial institutions become so focused on energy markets whenever tensions rise in the Middle East? Most people never stop to ask that question, and that may be exactly why they are often surprised by what happens next. Because the visible story and the real story are not always the same thing. The visible story is conflict. The deeper story is consequence. And consequence has a way of showing up in places nobody expects, especially in America. Think about it. Most Americans don't wake up wondering about the Strait of Hormuz. Most couldn't point to it on a map. Yet a disruption in that region could affect millions of households thousands of miles away. How is that possible? Because the modern economy runs on energy. Every truck, every airplane, every cargo ship, every delivery network, every supply chain, every grocery distribution system, everything depends on energy moving efficiently and predictably. When energy becomes uncertain, costs become uncertain. And when costs become uncertain, inflation becomes a problem. That is where things start getting interesting. For the past several years, inflation has already been one of the biggest economic concerns facing American families. People have felt it everywhere. At the grocery store, at the gas station, in housing costs, in insurance premiums, in everyday expenses that seemed manageable just a few years ago. Many Americans were told inflation was temporary, then they were told it was under control. Now a different question is emerging. What if inflation isn't finished? Not because of domestic politics, not because of government spending, not because of a single decision made in Washington, but because of forces far beyond America's borders. This is the possibility that financial markets are trying to understand right now. And there is a reason they are paying attention. History leaves clues. Whenever major energy disruptions occur, inflation often follows. Not immediately, not dramatically overnight, but gradually, quietly, then suddenly. Fuel becomes more expensive. Transportation costs increase. Businesses pass costs to consumers. Consumers reduce spending. Economic growth slows. And what began as an energy issue becomes something much larger. A cost of living issue, a household issue, a retirement issue, a future planning issue. That is the part most discussions leave out. People hear the word inflation and think of statistics, economists, government reports, Federal Reserve meetings. But inflation is not experienced through charts. It is experienced through life. It is the difference between financial comfort and financial pressure. It is the difference between saving and struggling. It is the difference between confidence and uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior. Families delay purchases. Businesses postpone investments. Retirees become more cautious. Investors become more defensive. The entire economic mood shifts. Which brings us back to the question that nobody seems to be asking. Why are markets reacting so strongly to events happening thousands of miles away? Because markets understand something most people don't. The economy is connected, far more connected than it appears. A disruption in one region can create consequences in another. A shipping delay can affect prices. A supply shock can affect spending. A rise in energy costs can affect everything from groceries to manufacturing. This isn't speculation. It's how modern economies work. And that creates an important contradiction. The public conversation focuses on military strategy. The financial conversation focuses on economic vulnerability. Those are not the same thing. One focuses on what is happening. The other focuses on what happens next. And what happens next is often far more important. Imagine two families watching the evening news. Both hear the same headlines, both hear the same updates, both hear the same political arguments. But one family asks a different question. What does this mean for us 6 months from now? That family is asking the right question, because the greatest economic risks rarely arrive with a warning label. They arrive disguised as something else: an international dispute, a supply disruption, a market fluctuation, a temporary crisis. Then months later, people suddenly realize their expenses have changed. Their purchasing power has changed. Their financial plans have changed. And they begin wondering when it happened. The truth is, it happened gradually, long before most people noticed. That is why moments like this deserve attention, not panic. Attention. There is a difference. Panic creates bad decisions, attention creates preparation, and preparation creates options. The reality is that nobody knows exactly what happens next. Tensions could ease, markets could stabilize, energy prices could settle, inflation pressures could cool. That outcome remains entirely possible. But another possibility exists, and that is what investors are trying to evaluate. What happens if energy markets remain unstable? What happens if costs continue rising? What happens if inflation proves more persistent than expected? What happens if economic uncertainty lasts longer than policymakers hope? Those are not military questions. They are personal questions. Questions about savings, questions about retirement, questions about investments, questions about family security, questions about the future. And that brings us back to where we started. Something doesn't add up, because the story most people are watching may not be the story that matters most. The headlines focus on conflict. The markets focus on consequence. The politicians focus on strategy. Ordinary Americans eventually feel the results. That pattern has repeated itself throughout history, and it may be repeating itself again. The deeper issue was never simply about military tensions. It was never simply about foreign policy. It was never simply about headlines. The deeper issue is how vulnerable modern life remains to forces most people rarely think about: energy, inflation, purchasing power, economic resilience, the things that quietly shape daily life. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. The events that change our financial future rarely begin as economic stories. They become economic stories later, usually after the consequences have already begun, which means the question isn't whether people are paying attention to the conflict. The real question is whether they are paying attention to what the conflict could become, because those are two very different things. And understanding that difference may matter far more than most people realize.